our discussion on the future of drones. My name is Ryan Hagemann. I will be the moderator this evening. A little bit of background on me. I am the Civil Liberties Policy Analyst for the Niskanen Center, and I am also an adjunct fellow specializing in robotics and automation for TechFreedom, which is a libertarian nonprofit focused on trying to promote technology freedom. I apologize if my voice sounds a little bit raspy. I'm actually getting over a little bit of sickness that I've been having recently. So my objective for this evening is going to be to introduce our two fine panelists with me today, start us off with some very basic questions, and then I hope that we can actually turn this into less of a lecture style symposium and actually produce a little bit more conversationalist style, especially since that means I'll have to talk that much less. So to begin, we have Erik Lin-Greenberg. He is a PhD student in political science at Columbia University, where he studies international relations. His research interests include military escalation, non-traditional security operations, and the use of air power. Prior to attending Columbia, he served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force and has deployed to Afghanistan and Southwest Asia. He continues to serve as an officer in the Air Force Reserve, and his writings have appeared in International Peacekeeping, Defense and Security Analysis, Air and Space Power Journal, The National Interest, and the South China Morning Post. Erik holds master's degrees from Columbia University and MIT and a bachelor's degree from MIT. Erik will be primarily focusing on the military aspect of drones for this panel conversation. To my right is Lisa Ellman. She is a partner and the co-chair with the UAS, which stands for Unmanned Aircraft or Aerial Systems practice group at Hogan Lovells. Previously, she held senior positions at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and the Office of Presidential Personnel. Additionally, she has served as the Chief Counselor for the Open Government Partnership for the Executive Office of the President, representing the U.S. in international efforts to make government more efficient, effective, transparent, and collaborative. She has advised more than 40 countries on open government strategy and has worked in close partnership with civil society organizations and private industry to further these commitments. She earned her BA in history from the University of Michigan and her JD and MPP from the University of Chicago Law School and Harris School of Public Policy. That, please welcome me please join me in welcoming our fine panelists today. And I think I would like to start off by lobbing a question over to Erik, because traditionally, especially in this day and age, when we think of drones, I think most of us immediately go to the image of flying death robots over the sky, unleashing hellfire on innocent victims below on the terrestrial ground. So I think I'd like Erik to sort of begin by describing what drones from a military perspective are, how they're used, and what the process of actually engaging in air power strikes looks like. So with that, Erik,
So thanks again for the intro, and also for everyone for kind of making it out tonight. I know it's disgustingly uncomfortable outside, so thanks for coming in and talking to us about drones. I'm going to start though with a few things. First, as a caveat, as Ryan mentioned, I'm an officer in the Air Force. Everything I say, though, is not necessarily representative of kind of government or Air Force positions. The second thing is, I know the term drones gets thrown around a lot. You heard the UAS line as well, an unmanned aerial system. The military likes to call them remotely piloted aircraft, or RPAs. So we might use those terms a little bit interchangeably. And the idea behind remotely piloted aircraft is that these are not drones that just kind of fly around in the sky. There's actually a pilot. In the case of the Air Force, it's a commissioned officer who goes through, in many cases, normal flight school, so the same flight training that a pilot that's flying an F-22 would go through, who's operating these drones, albeit remotely and separated from the aircraft. That being said, how do these drones or RPAs actually work in the military today? So the first thing is, drones are really not a new phenomenon. They've been around for decades. At the end of World War II, the United States actually tried to use an unmanned weapon system to go target both Nazi and Japanese military installations. Didn't work out too well, but the initial concept in terms of militarized drones, I think really began at that point. They were used again during the Vietnam War for reconnaissance. But what happened, between the Vietnam War and today is you had a lot of advances in technology. So much more advanced sensors that allow us to see things, to hear things, much better satellite communications. So we don't need to have, a pilot sitting in a, plane that's only a few miles away from the drone flying it. The ability to actually use these things again rather than just launch them and then have them crash into a target or crash into the water when they're done. So drones today, I think, represent a grouping of new technologies, but it's not necessarily something that's, this thing that didn't exist in the past. So I think that's one of the big myths about drones and military use of drones that needs to be demystified a little bit. The second element is this notion of how drones are operated, right? We hear the term drones, and we often think that there's some 18-year-old video gamer sitting in the middle of a desert in Nevada who's flying these things around. As I alluded to earlier, that's really not the case in terms of the larger military RPAs like the Predator and the Reaper that we often hear about in the news. They're flown by military aircrews, and I spent the first 3 years of my military career working what's called the distributed ground station. So it's a ground site where literally hundreds of analysts are looking at the data that comes from these aircraft. These folks have gone through more than a year of training before they're allowed to sit and look at videos or still imagery that's being collected by aircraft. So our job is essentially to talk to the guys on the ground, so be it soldiers, Marines, Special Operations Forces, talk to combat operations centers, so tactical operations centers, and try to figure out what they need. And then we try to get an RPA to the location to provide an additional set of eyes, and in some cases, some firepower onto a target. So that's kind of just the general idea of how these RPAs operate. They have a very, very large and robust network of individuals behind them that have a significant amount of training, and it's not just one pilot sitting there flying these things around. There are certain smaller UASs, smaller RPAs that you can launch out of a backpack, and in those cases, yeah, it might be a soldier who's sitting there with a small computer, laptop-sized computer, looking at the imagery. But the RPAs that we hear a lot about in the media are typically manned by large crews. And then just one more quick little thing is we often think of the drone program as these targeted strikes that are carried out in Pakistan. But there's a distinction that we can talk about later between Title 10 missions, which are the military missions, and Title 50 missions, which are the kind of covert action type of missions. There's a distinction between those two categories, and we can talk about those in a bit.
Okay. So good, a brief overview of what we're talking about in terms of military drones from Erik. Now I'd like to take it over to Lisa and actually discuss something of a newer phenomenon. We've all been very used to hearing about military drone operations, especially since the United States got itself involved over in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq almost 15 years ago. But recent developments have actually made commercial drone operations much more viable and much more appealing to a lot of companies, especially companies like Amazon, who are looking at actually utilizing these types of systems and platforms for making deliveries, amongst a myriad of other potential uses. So I'd like to take it over to Lisa, who has actually had some practical firsthand experience dealing with the public policy implications of the privacy components of this, being integrated into the national airspace and the trouble surrounding that. So Lisa, if you'd like to just give us a little bit of background on what your experience has been in the public policy realm as it relates to commercial integration of drones, and anything that you think we need to know from a commercial perspective, would be great.
Great, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, everyone. It's great to be here. So just to provide a little bit more context in terms of how I ended up running a drones practice in the private sector, and everyone keeps asking me, there is such a thing as a drones practice now in the private sector at a law firm that never would have existed actually a year ago. So this is all, it is a new phenomenon, but at the same time, as you know, in the military context, drones have been around for a really long time. So first about me, I come from the Obama administration. I worked in the federal government for many years. I worked on the first campaign. President Obama was actually my law professor at University of Chicago, and he was my mentor in law school. So he asked me to work on his first presidential campaign as a policymaker. I did, including working on policy issues involving technology and innovation and moving our government forward. And then that continued over the next several years, of course, once we came to Washington. And I worked both in the Department of Justice and at the White House in various roles in the most part, promoting innovation in policymaking. So working to make our government more open by bringing technology and emerging technologies to the government and making our government more 21st century, but also promoting the use of new technologies in many ways. So in 2012, drones can refer to anything from a toy, like a model aircraft that kids fly at the park and have for many years, to a tool of industry now, as we're seeing, to even a tool of war. And the federal government, over the last several years, these consumer toys have gotten a lot more sophisticated, a lot more smaller, more mobile, and able to do really sophisticated things, such that industry started to be excited to be able to use them. They're also cheaper. The technology has moved forward at a really rapid pace. And so while the federal government as a whole, the FAA, which regulates the safety and security of the national airspace, had been paying attention to the, kind of knew that drones were coming. But the federal government as a whole really started to pay attention in 2012 when Congress mandated that the federal government integrate drones into our national airspace. And it was at that time, I was at the White House. Soon after that, I was asked to go run drones policy at the Department of Justice and represent the Department of Justice on the White House's interagency working group that was considering all of the issues involved with integrating drones into our national airspace here in our country. So you can imagine all of the different safety and security and privacy questions that would come up in the scope of those conversations. And so I worked there, or did that for a year, saw the huge potential for the industry, and had wanted to move into private practice anyways at some point. And so came into the private sector and now running a drones practice. And I can explain a little bit more what that entails. But the gist is companies all over the country and around the world now are realizing the benefits of drones for their own industries. So real estate agents want to be able to use drones to take pictures of the homes that they're selling. Oil and gas companies want to be able to use drones to inspect infrastructure, to inspect their power plants, to do all flare stack power line inspections. Tasks that are dirty or dangerous or dreary. In agriculture, farmers want to be able to use drones to inspect their crops and crop dust, spray pesticides, spray water on their crops. Facebook and Google want to be able to provide wireless internet to all around the world with drones. And of course, Amazon wants to deliver packages. We've all heard about that on 60 Minutes. With this interest, but this is a typical kind of Washington, D.C. area where the technology has moved way more quickly than the policy making. So you have this very strong demand to be able to use drones commercially, but it's actually illegal right now in our country to use drones commercially unless you have special permission from the FAA. So over the past several years, the federal government has been working on this. The FAA recently issued a notice of proposed rulemaking, the proposed rule that will actually authorize the use of drones commercially in our country. And it's going through kind of a review process right now. There were about 4,500 comments that were submitted as part of that process from the public, and the FAA is reviewing that now. But in the meantime, you need to have what's known as a 333 exemption in order to be able to fly a drone. So when you see in the news clips, you'll see filmmakers, movie makers get permission to fly drones. It's because they filed for a 333 exemption and were granted this license from the FAA to be able to fly drones. One of the interesting things about this area is that it's not an area, right now the law is kind of structured so that it's, hobbyists can actually, for the most part, do whatever they want. So I can go to the park, not here in Washington, D.C., because this is restricted airspace, but if I go 12 miles out, I can fly, go to Virginia or Maryland and go to a park and fly my drone and take photos of myself and put those photos on Facebook, and that is a totally legal flight. If I going to that park know that, these are going to be amazing photos. Like no one's seen photos like these before. I'm going to sell these photos for $10 a piece. That is an illegal flight and actually not allowed by the FAA. It's not a safety or risk-based question. It's the same exact flight. It's an intent-based question. So the law is structured on what is your intent? Is it commercial or is it recreational? And that's comes from the aviation world, which has been, the laws have been structured that way for a while, but there's a lot of question in the public policy community about whether that actually makes sense in this area. But there have been lots of safety concerns, lots of privacy concerns, but also lots of excitement about about incorporating drones into our national airspace. And I look forward to hearing what you all think about commercial drones and whether you're excited, whether you're nervous about the privacy concerns. But all of this work is right now in process, and I really do believe this is where the future is going. We're going to see, NASA right now is designing kind of highways in the sky. This is all going to be, you're going to have highways of drones that fly underneath manned aircraft, but over structures, and we're just beginning to see what it's going to look like, but it's really very exciting.
All right, thank you. So off to a good start here. Following up with you, Eric, you had discussed previously at the butt end of what you were discussing about Title 10 versus Title 50 missions and the differences between those. I was wondering if you could go a little bit more in depth as to the differences between those and what it means for drone operations. And then if you wouldn't mind, I remember we had discussed that you actually have some very nascent research that you're doing in pursuing your PhD at Columbia regarding what impact drones could potentially have in contributing to military escalation overseas. So I was wondering if you could just, take us through all three bits of those.
Sure, I'll answer the first question first. I don't claim to be an expert in public international law or kind of U.S. code, but Title 10 missions are typically, and feel free to jump in and correct me if I go too far astray or off course. So Title 10 missions are typically those associated with military operations. So your military RPA operations that are being flown over Afghanistan, currently, in support of U.S. operations against ISIS, in Iraq. Those are your Title 10 missions. They're flown by military crews. They take their, chain of command from the president kind of through the combatant commands, and those are considered traditional military operations, right? Your Title 50 missions are typically what we see, happening outside of war zones. So our counterterrorism missions that are often, viewed as kind of these targeted killing operations. And the approval process for covert actions is very different. And it goes kind of from the executive office through a series of memorandums that get sent out to different individuals within the government. And that's kind of the authorization process for Title 50 missions. Those missions are, not necessarily flown by military crews. And I think that's one of the big distinctions that's often blurred in the media, right? We say drones, and we think that, it's all the same, but there's really a distinction kind of in how those missions are carried out, even though in many cases they use the same type of aircraft. Do you have anything to kind of add on to Title 10 and 50?
That's good.
Okay. And the second question dealt with kind of drones and military escalation, and that is what my incredibly nascent dissertation looks at. So a lot of the research on drones today is very much anecdotally based. It's based on, let's read through the New York Times and figure out what some politician, what some policymaker has said, and no one's actually tried to test the causal effect of what drones could either initiate or escalate conflict. So I'm using a series of experimental tests. I just wrapped up a very basic pilot experiment last week that surveyed about 1,200 respondents and asked them, hey, there's this hypothetical attack on a U.S. military reconnaissance aircraft. What do you think the best policy response is? But those 1,200 respondents are broken into various treatment groups, and those treatment groups include an attack on a drone, an attack on a manned aircraft, so a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft where the pilot's killed, and an attack on a U-2 where the pilot isn't killed. And the question to the respondents is, well, what do you think we as the United States should do? And the options range from basically do nothing to do lots, right? So you have very low hawkishness and very high hawkishness, and you have this ordinal scale. And as you'd expect, folks that are exposed to an attack on a manned aircraft are much more likely to call for much more hawkish actions than those that see an attack on a drone. What's interesting, though, is people don't seem to care whether or not a pilot dies in the attack, right? The statistical significance is just not there between the attack on a manned aircraft with loss of life and an attack on a manned aircraft without loss of life, which suggests to me that intent matters, right? Getting back to your discussion of intent, if the intent of the adversary was to potentially take down an aircraft knowing that there's a man inside, that's what matters, it seems, at least at this point, to the American public. And just kind of a little bit of an overview.
Okay. Just to follow up on this discussion from a military perspective, I saw recently that approximately, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but something on the order of 25% of the total aircraft fleet wielded by the U.S. Air Force is now drones, as of 2012 anyway. nowadays, as opposed to in 2001, I think it was something like 2 or 3%. Do you see drones ultimately taking over entirely our Air Force? I mean, is there a reason for us to continue having manned aircraft? Do we really gain much by actually accommodating aircraft to allow pilots inside of them, or are we ultimately better off not putting people up in planes anymore? Well, what do you see the future of the U.S. Air Force's breakdown of piloted versus unmanned aircraft being?
Sure. So I think any weapon of war is designed as a tool that's supposed to meet some type of political objective, right? So policymakers, decision makers need to pick the right tool for that particular policy objective. And right now, drones are great for certain things, but they really don't have the payload of a manned bomber, right? You can send a Predator up with a few Hellfire strapped to it. That's not going to bring the same kind of damage on a set of targets as a fully loaded B-1 bomber. Drones are great for certain types of strikes. Heavier bombers are great for other types of strikes. So as we wait for the technological development, I think you'll see perhaps a slowly growing number of drones at threshold of being able to meet the same type of policy objectives with a manned aircraft, or rather with a drone that can with a manned aircraft. I think you're going to see this division. The other thing is there's a kind of a political or cultural divide within the U.S. military. Right now, it's not cool to be a drone pilot, right? Everyone who's a pilot wants to be a fighter pilot, wants to fly something fast and sexy. Sitting in a box in Nevada or somewhere else flying a drone isn't fast and sexy. So the military is trying to get around that by creating new career fields. So we just recently created a program where you can be a career drone pilot, and you go through some type of flight training, and then you go through a specialized RPA pilot track as a training pipeline. So there's these attempts to make slight changes in the cultural perception within the military of RPAs versus manned aircraft. But if you look at kind of our historical Air Force leaders, they've typically been guys that fly manned aircraft. And so there's a lot of political resistance to having a fully unmanned fleet.
Lisa, I wanted to go back and discuss the recent FAA rules that were promulgated around commercial drones. Among them, if I recall correctly, we have visual line of sight restrictions, we have daylight only operations, we have drones cannot be flown over groups of individuals not directly involved in the operation of the drone, and there are a few others that the FAA promulgated. I was looking on the Open Technology Institute, which is an initiative funded by the New America Foundation. They have this great map online where you can actually click on different countries, and it actually gives you like a breakdown of the various regulations in different countries surrounding commercial drones domestically. And it seems like a lot of other countries kind of sort of have these same like weight, daylight only, and visual line of sight restrictions. However, a lot of other countries are accumulating a lot more foreign direct investment in drones, and they're seeing a lot more innovation occur in the area of drones. Is this because they got the rules right early on, or is there something more magical about these other countries? Because based on what I see in terms of like the market breakdown, it seems like the United States is really falling very far behind in commercial drone technology. So I was wondering if you might comment.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the areas where the United States, we have been behind. We're slowly catching up, or hopefully quickly catching up, but other countries have definitely been ahead of us here in terms of commercial drones. Canada, for example, has a pretty, in that website that with the map is actually a great resource. One of the hard things about, there's often a lot of confusion about what the rules are for commercial drones in every country. They're actually pretty hard to find in lots of countries, so it is a very good resource. But other countries that have been much farther ahead of us include Canada. They have a tiered approach where any drone 4.4 pounds or less is broadly permitted, even for commercial operations, whereas 4.4 pounds to 55 pounds, they're regulated, but you can still get permission from the government to fly. Australia, New Zealand. In Japan, 85% of crop dusting is already done with drones. In England, Domino's has delivered a pizza using a drone. In countries around the world, other countries have figured this out. Now, there's a few different reasons for that. And I do think the overall message here is that we're catching up. And so I think, so that's good. But one is that we just don't have the data. You were mentioning kind of how a lot of the data that you have on drone use is anecdotal. In the commercial drones industry, it's very rare that you're regulating in a space where we literally have no safety data to go on. So for example, if you're a policymaker and you're asked to put together some rules about allowing commercial drones into the national airspace, or allowing drones in general into the national airspace, there are a lot of different layers there and different things that you're going to need to ask. We've had hobbyists fly drones for many years, but that hasn't been studied, and it's much more spontaneous going and flying in a park with my family with a small remote controlled aircraft or model airplane. It's very different from sustained continuous use by an Amazon package delivery drone, for example. Very different than what policymakers need in terms of the data that's provided. Military is very different as well. So we don't have any data. Usually if you're regulating in healthcare, you're regulating in energy or environment or food and drugs, you have studies and you have data and you have numbers, and you're able to analyze those numbers and try to come to some public policy solution. So one thing that's been very different here is that we don't have the data, and some other countries have been ahead of us in terms of collecting data and doing studies. So just an example of this, there's been a lot of talk about the microdrone proposal. So as part of the rule that was released on February 15th, there was the FAA asked for comment from the public on whether they believe that microdrones, meaning 4.4 pounds or less, the kind of tiered approach that Canada has opted to take, makes sense for us here in the United States. Now, it seems pretty obvious that a drone that's 4 pounds versus, or 1 pound or 2 pounds or 3 pounds versus a drone that is 55 pounds would present very different risks to the public if it falls out of the sky, right? Offhand, that seems like a very obvious solution. But then the question becomes, well, what about frangibility? So frangibility is a study of materials. If a 4-pound drone gets caught in a jet aircraft engine, what does it do to that engine? Now, for years, in terms of regulating aircraft safety, the FAA did lots of studies basically throwing like pigeons into a jet engine and seeing what happens. We have opted to, not real pigeons, but you know what I mean, like studying birds that hit jet engines. Now, does a 4-pound drone have the same impact on a jet engine as a bird, or does it have because it has could have a lithium ion battery in it, would it actually make a jet engine explode like a big 55-pound drone? And those are the questions that are being asked, and that's just data that we don't have. And so that explains kind of our lack of progress. The other thing that I would say is that we have the most complex airspace in the world. And so, you know, Canada, Australia, New Zealand have a lot more open space. And right now, the FAA is regulating, their job is to regulate the safety and security of the national airspace. Their job is to prevent accidents. So the incentive is not incredibly high for them to just open the airspace to anyone who wants to be able to fly drones. But they're, you know, compared to like wide open spaces, the idea is they're regulating as if drones will fall out of the sky at any time, which I don't know. Does anyone here have a drone, by the way? Like own a hobbyist drone or have flown one or seen one flown? You guys have got to get a drone. Okay. They're so much fun. They're great. But if you have my two for the holidays, very exciting, very romantic gift, I know. But I was thrilled. And it's a great drone, but it falls out of it falls. I mean, and I'm a great pilot. I consider myself a great pilot, but no matter how good I am, it's going to fall out of the sky. And that's how the FAA regulates. So, which makes sense. They don't care if they fall out of the sky as long as there's not someone there to you know, head in the head. So, which explains a lot of the caveats included in the proposed rulemaking. So, flying within your line of sight, so I'm able to see it without other people around, not in congested spaces or not in congested areas, so not in urban locations, for example, in daytime, so I can see what I'm doing, what's going on. That's why so rural areas, like in most of that state, fly pretty much anywhere you want. But if you're in New York City, you know, you have to be very careful, and you can't fly in congested areas like that. So, you know, we have a very complex airspace. the United States is likely the most complex airspace in the world, and so that also partly explains why the U.S. has been behind. But and the FAA was given very limited resources in the beginning to really implement a lot of what it was asked to do, and that is now improving. And so I hope and expect that we'll see continued great, and they've made great progress on the 333 exemption process. We've had over 2,000 companies apply for permission to be able to fly drones, and more than 500 have been approved. And that process itself has been very expedited now. So it's not as complicated if you're a company looking to fly drones. So there's been many tangible steps in the last few months that have been taken that will lead to a more open airspace for folks who are interested in flying drones. But because of the lack of data, and because of our complex airspace, and because of these different issues, it has been a slower process here in the U.S.
Okay, great. So at this time, I am going to open it up to questions from any, especially because my voice is a little bit tired right now. So please, if anyone has any thoughts on their mind, I am more than happy to let our panelists engage with you, if only just to give my voice a little bit of a break. Yes.
Andrew Baxter, CDI. I actually have a question about what is the fundamental difference between other types of flying, like for example, like a model airplane. They seem to be heavier, I would guess, than 4 pounds. What is it, the height or altitude, or?
In terms of hobbyist drones?
Yeah, so as opposed to, it seems like how it was presented is that these drones are facing a new regulation, like something that's unique for the FAA to deal with. Whereas I feel like those model planes that seem like they can get to a relatively high altitude at far distances.
That is exactly right. Well, so this is where a lot of the confusion has come in the drones industry, is that if you're a hobbyist, meaning you're flying recreationally for fun, I have, let's say I have a Parrot drone, I want to be able to fly just for fun. I can do whatever I want with that drone. I can go to the park, I can fly up to 400 feet. I can, as long as I'm not recklessly endangering the public, I pretty much have broad authorization to fly within kind of a set of community-based guidelines. But the idea is that now, and for the last several decades, I've been able to go fly my model airplane. But if I own a real estate company and I want to use my drone that I own privately to be able to take photos of properties that I'm selling and post those up on the internet for my clients to be able to see, that is illegal. So it's not actually about, it's just an intent test. So the same model airplane in the same flight can be authorized in one case and then not authorized in the other case. But and that's where a lot of the confusion has come in, because you see lots of companies. I have a lot of folks who come to me with wanting help navigating the regulatory and public policy kind of regime in this area, and they say, I'm a company and I want to be able to fly my drones. What if I just don't charge for this flight? What if I just take lots of photos and my clients are paying me for other things, but they're not actually paying for this picture? You have a lot of companies that are trying to get around the rules by trying to coin themselves hobbyists. They're just flying recreationally. It's really fun and they're excited to do it, but they're not getting paid for that. But the FAA has recently come out with some new guidance to make clear that if you're flying in any way where the spirit is a commercial flight, even if you're not getting paid for that specific flight, it's still considered a commercial flight. But that, like, exactly your question is the reason why there's been so much confusion, because people don't understand why they can do something in one set of circumstances, but it's if they intend to sell things or make money in any way or do something in promoting a business, then they actually have to get a special permission from the FAA, which is quite a process. And so it's kind of straddling that line, which has been difficult for a lot of folks. There's a lot of illegal activity out there as well. There are a lot of, you just go on the internet and press, like, and search commercial drones. There will be 1,000 commercial drone, aerial photographers telling you they'll come take pictures of your wedding with a drone, and I guarantee you they don't have a 333 exemption to do that. The FAA does not have the resources to police all of the illegal activity that's out there, but if for some reason something were to go wrong, or if the flight were in some way to recklessly endanger the public, then there would be, including flyaway drone that gets close to an airplane or lands on the White House lawn.
Ruins a wedding.
Right, exactly. Then there could be really big problems for that person or that entity.
Hi, I'm Gabriel. I was wondering this is for either of you, how are we working to protect the more sensitive sites like the White House or I guess a military institution from even like hobbyists? Because you're just taking it up and you might accidentally take a photo of something you shouldn't be.
Right. So there was actually a I can speak just quickly on this.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, on this side of it. There was actually post 9/11, there was new NOTAM, like new airman requirements that of temporary flight restrictions that included restrictions of flying over nuclear sites, restrictions flying over sensitive areas. That is actually, and there are a lot of folks out there now who say they want to be a sensitive. They don't want folks, like companies love drones and they hate drones. They love drones because they want to use them, but they hate them because they don't want others to be able to fly over their property. And that's true in the hobbyist space too. We all want to go fly our own drones, but we don't want someone else's drone snooping on us in our own backyard, right? Does anyone here watch Modern Family? Yeah. Okay, so you saw the episode. For those who didn't see this episode, it was an amazing episode. The family was sunbathing outside. A drone comes into the backyard and starts videotaping the family as they're sunbathing out in the yard. And the dad takes a net and is trying to swat it away, trying to hit it and swat it away. And his swimming trunks fall to the ground. And so he's totally naked. The video gets all the footage and speeds away. And the drone speeds away. And then the next day up on YouTube, there was a video called Drone 1, Idiot Nothing. And anyways, it was a great it was a great episode, but it really encapsulates a lot of the fears of the American people. So while the FAA is most concerned about the safety issues, they're most concerned about the they don't want to see a drone hit an aircraft. They don't have any jurisdiction over privacy. That's not what they do. In the government process, which I described, working on these issues, I took the lead actually on the privacy issues because I was representing Department of Justice, and we have some expertise in that area. And so there was a presidential memorandum on privacy, transparency, accountability, and civil liberties that was released the same day that the proposed rule was released on February 15th. And it outlined limits on the federal government's own use of drones, and then put together a multi-stakeholder process, which will be hosted by the Department of Commerce, which will start next month sometime, most likely, where there will be a multi-stakeholder process to talk about privacy issues surrounding the commercial use of drones. So it's an ongoing conversation. We've seen in most states in our union have proposed legislation of some kind that would limit drone use because of privacy concerns in some way. Some of that legislation has passed. California, for example, has an anti-paparazzi drone law where it's like broadly applicable, but was aimed at paparazzi, basically saying if someone has a reasonable expectation of privacy, you cannot take a picture of them with a drone. But the question is, drones are a platform for a camera or other technology, right? So what is the difference between a pole camera and a helicopter and a drone? And when do you need specific drone-specific rules? And this is what policy need rules, and when do you just need maybe some better privacy rules on the books to make sure that we're protected? Because a lot of the risks or potential harms that drones could potentially provide would also apply with other technologies such as a satellite or a pole camera or a helicopter flying over your house. You can see the same thing. So the question is, where are the relevant differences and where do we need specific rules in place?
So from the military perspective, I think it's something that's become a lot more cognizant or salient in the past few years. I think about 6 weeks ago, the Pentagon publicly came out and said that they shot down this drone, right, is essentially something similar to what you're flying in the park, right? But it's something that we didn't consider just a few years ago. And I think one of the questions when you're dealing not with a non-state group like ISIS, but with a state, right, is targeting someone else's drones an act of war, right? And what's the threshold for actual conflict? So October 2013 timeframe, both China and Japan were flying unmanned aircraft over the Senkakus, and both sides said, yes, if you take down one of our unmanned aircraft, that will constitute that as an act of war. So I think that those are some broader questions that need to be considered in addition to kind of the technological means of downing an aircraft.
And there, of course, DOD has properties here in the United States, like training facilities, that kind of thing. What if someone tries to fly a drone over their training facilities? I mean, there are a lot of places here that could be considered sensitive. But is imbalanced though, because on the federal government side, you don't want to consider everything sensitive, because like news gatherers, for example, would say like they don't want to be censored out of gathering news from perfectly legitimate locations. And where do you draw the line? And then on the other side, you have a lot of folks who say, well, my retail, my store is sensitive and I don't want drones flying over my store. There's actually a new website called noflyzone.org, and it's basically a do not call list essentially for drones. If you go in there, and I don't know if you all live in DC, but so it wouldn't really be relevant here because it's restricted airspace anyways, but if I live out in Maryland and I have a property, I can go in there, put my address in, and the idea is, it's still being developed, but the idea is that participating manufacturers would put geofencing technology that boxes out that address in particular. So an Amazon drone wouldn't be able to fly over my house even if they wanted to, or my neighbor's drone wouldn't be able to fly over my house even if they wanted to, they were trying to. Now, there are some concerns with that, particularly that it's voluntary and manufacturers don't have a lot of incentive to opt in. But DJI, after the White House drone incident, did announce that it already had geofencing technology in its drones, which is a thing. And they expanded that to include kind of the White House and other restricted airspace, basically that if you have the most updated technology on your DJI drone and you've downloaded the latest app, it shouldn't be able to fly over the White House even if it tried. So that, I think, is an example of where technology can perhaps provide a lot of the solutions to some of these public policy issues that we're seeing.
Yeah, the drone that ended up in Iran, is it believed that the Iranians actually gained access to the software controlling that drone? Did Achilles' heels of
I mean, I think I'm probably privy to the same information that has been out in public media about that. And I think that is kind of one of the main concerns if any aircraft is downed anywhere, right? It's what access is there to that aircraft, what information was taken out. I think CNN broadcast something saying the week after that aircraft was down, every flight from Beijing to Iran was booked, right? And I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't have insight into that.
But don't have insight into
what,
the technical,
into what was potentially lost or
forget that particular incident, but a drone is controlled remotely.
Mm-hmm.
If someone else could gain control of that drone remotely,
yeah, absolutely.
That's a big disadvantage to drones versus piloted aircraft. A little harder to take control of those.
Well, although there was that guy that just like a week or two ago claims he took control of like United Airlines or American Airlines aircraft through the wireless that airplanes offer now. Like through the internet access that they provide on their planes, they were able to actually hack into the operating system. That's what he's claiming.
Right. Who knows if that's true? I think so I think that is a risk, that any system could potentially be hacked, and I think both in the private sector and also kind of government sector, you look at means to kind of secure that, whether it's through the data links that you're using and trying to figure out how to make those data links more robust and more secure. And I think another issue is not just that the controls are hacked, but that the information downlinks and uplinks are hacked as well, right? So what happens if, whether it's a private, drone or a military RPA, what happens if someone else is able to hack in and see what the operator is seeing, right? You can see the potential disadvantages from the military operations standpoint, and you could see, potential, significant privacy concerns from private sector drone operations. So I think that is a plausible and real concern, but I think kind of industry and the government and private sector are considering that and figuring out ways to try to mitigate that.
Yeah, I'm interested in the, is there any, about drones, use of drones in war, is there any international law that regulates internationally usage of drones?
So, I mean, theoretically, war is governed by the law of armed conflict, right? Both in war and kind of the lead up to war, so what's considered a just war and what's not considered a just war. But there really hasn't been any kind of formal guidance on drone use. I think the UN had a special rapporteur that looked at the use of drones in very specific situations. But again, there's really no formal international law that applies to drone use. Even when you look at airspace, right, the Chicago Convention doesn't apply to state aircraft. It only applies to civilian aircraft. So there really hasn't been, any kind of specific drone law, but I think a lot of people are able to take, elements of the law of armed conflict and try to apply it to drone operations, right? So we look at things like necessity, and we look at things like that and try to figure out how existing law of armed conflict applies to new technologies. And we don't have a set of laws for guns. We don't necessarily have a set of laws for aircraft, right? It's as new weapon systems evolve, we try to figure out how we interpret existing law in the best way possible for military operations.
Yes.
I had a question on escalation. You said,
Sure.
I mean, you're saying basically that states or individuals may perceive an attack on a drone versus a manned aircraft as more or less escalatory, right? And I wonder if you're considering the potential for miscalculation as well, that because you may target something and you may not know whether it's a manned aircraft.
Incredibly measure experimentally, right? Because it's very difficult, but I think that's a critical thing that I need to figure out how to actually consider. There's this notion of a threat that leaves something to chance, right? That Tom Schelling came up with, and I think that's very, very prevalent with drone operations. I think that is one of the biggest concerns right now. If you look at kind of the East China Sea situation, some of the missions and this is all kind of unclassified information, the Japanese publish every single intercept that they conduct. A good chunk of these aircraft that the Japanese intercept are manned Chinese aircraft, and others are unmanned aircraft. But if I'm a SAM operator on the ground and all I see is a blip on my radar, I don't necessarily know if that aircraft is manned or unmanned. And if I'm a trigger happy guy and I have rules of engagement that say if my aircraft enters this area, I'm going to take it down, it's a very significant concern. And if you have ideas on how I should go about trying to measure it, I'd be more than happy to talk to you offline. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Could you talk about maybe historically, you mentioned that the difference between hobbyist and using drones commercially, that it's mostly intent-based and not based on safety, and why that decision was made to go forward in that direction?
I'm sorry, you mean the intent test?
Yeah.
Yeah, that comes from aviation. Generally, there are different rules for commercial aircraft and for like a recreational or sports pilot, for example. So it just, the problem with drones law right now is that it's very different in certain ways from manned aircraft in a lot of ways, but it's taken kind of a similar structure, legal structure, and grafted it onto drones, which doesn't entirely make a lot of sense. So for an example right now is that if you have a 333 exemption and you're looking to fly commercially, right now you actually need a manned aircraft pilot's license in order to be able to fly. Under the idea that drones are aircraft, and under the federal aviation regulations, you need to be a pilot in order to be able to fly an aircraft, and that is not a requirement that the FAA feels it has the ability statutorily to waive. And so it's led to a somewhat absurd result where you have these companies who want to be able to fly drones, and someone who's been flying drones for many years as a hobbyist or plays video games and is very good at flying drones, because that's like a great training, frankly, for flying drones, is not able to do so because they don't have a manned aircraft pilot's license. So a lot of companies have to then hire out that ability or find someone that has a sports or recreational pilot's license, which is also accepted. But it doesn't make a lot of sense. The proposed rule, which was outlined, will take care of that. They will provide for a UAS operator certificate, and you can just go to a local knowledge center across the country. Kind of like going to your local DMV, you take a test, and if you pass the test, you can become a UAS operator. You pay a small fee, and you'll be certified. So, but that is once the rule becomes final. So that's not for a year and a half or so to 2 years away.
Yes. Good. A new one.
So it sounds like a lot of other countries are taking big steps in allowing drones to become commercially used. So I was wondering, in the next 5-10 years, do you think the U.S. is going to take similar steps? And, to what extent do you think that's going to change, like, the flight industry, military use for the Air Force? With that?
Well, in the commercial sector, yes, in the next year, like by the end of next year, I'd be surprised if there was not a final rule broadly authorizing commercial operations across the United States. That will very much change kind of how business is done, because I think you'll have a lot of companies who are going to be, like right now, the biggest burden on companies who are looking to enter this industry is the fact that it's illegal right now, and they have to go through this pretty long, detailed process in order to get permission to fly. So a lot of folks are kind of waiting to enter this industry, but really every industry has a need for drones, and if they haven't identified that need, they will tomorrow. There's so many different uses out there for everything from, package delivery to precision agriculture to industrial uses and everything in between. And I think we're just going to see a airspace system that is shifting. You're going to see drones flying as well as helicopters and as well as airplanes, and and the key is getting that right and incorporating collision avoidance technology and transponders and as much of the safety equipment as we can into these drones, so that we're making sure that we're not doing something, or there's no catastrophes. But that's on the commercial side. I don't know.
Excuse me. And I think there's an interesting nexus kind of between the military side of the house and the commercial private sector side of the house. The military has long relied on private firms to help us out with training exercises. So we have private companies that fly aerial refueling tankers. There are aggressor aircraft, so folks that mimic adversary tactics that are privately flown. When I was in Kandahar, I guess it was 3 or 4 years ago now, I got off the plane at the airport, and inside the military passenger terminal, there was an advertisement from a Canadian firm that was advertising military drones, essentially timeshare style. So countries that couldn't, and these are unarmed, RPAs, it's an Israeli-built system, but they were, for the highest bidder, you could buy a few hours of flight time. So if you were a small country that couldn't necessarily afford to have your own or bid for time from someone else's, you could go pay these guys money and they would go escort your convoy for you and tell you if people were, a few hundred meters ahead. And they seem to be doing a pretty lucrative business. I talked to these guys, and yeah. So I think that you'll probably see, more and more private operators trying to actually get military contracts down the road. But that's just me.
Yeah. So why is the data from other countries that they have on commercial drones, why is that not available to us?
It is. I mean, we work with other countries, but I mean, none of their airspace is not nearly as congested as ours. Like our airspace is just a lot more complex than pretty much anywhere in the world. So some of it helps us here. And I mean, the Canadian example of the tiered approach is what gave us the idea to do a micro drones exemption. So you're seeing international influence there. But on a lot of these questions, I think that regulators want to see the data that they actually, that not necessarily companies are compiling, but that academics and independent entities and think tanks are able to compile on a lot of these questions.
Yeah, you mentioned that the purpose of a weapon is to accomplish a political objective. What's the thinking in the military about the usefulness of drones in this regard? And let me give a little example of something I saw a video by ISIS of a targeted killing they were carrying out in Iraq. And what they did was dress up in Iraqi army uniforms, go knock on the target's door. When he opened it, bust in, kill him, behead him, as a matter of fact. But they didn't bother the wife or the kids. Now, how would we have accomplished that objective? We would have sent a missile into the house from 10,000 feet. We might or might not kill the target, might or might not kill the wife, the kids, the family dog, maybe a neighbor or two. Might ask yourself, which method is more barbaric, since that word comes up often in discussion with ISIS. But the question for me is, does that bring into question the usefulness of drones in this regard, targeted killings? There's a lot of sentiment out there that we're making more enemies than we're killing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings up this question of kind of tactical effectiveness versus strategic effectiveness. And I think in many cases at the operational level, military units often look at the tactical effectiveness of the system, right? And
they like their toy. They're really-
I would consider it.
There's some of that in there.
I don't think it's ever viewed as a toy when there's a life on the line. I think everyone.
Well, they like their high technology. I mean,
Definitely, but I mean, the folks that I think I had the humbling privilege of working with, the airmen that were looking at these feeds every day, took the job incredibly seriously, and I think that is one of the things that allows military RPAs to be so effective. You say that we're going to drop a hellfire on someone's house. In many cases, we don't need to do that, right? We can find a target, we can monitor that target, and this is all been covered pretty extensively in official media channels. But we can find out when that target is going to be out on his own, right, without his family, and we're able to minimize a lot of that collateral damage using RPAs because they can loiter for dozens of hours at a time, track the individual. We can hand off that particular target to another aircraft. So in many cases, you're able to have actually much more precise targeting. So one of the cases that's gotten just a lot of media attention in the past maybe 10 years or so was the targeting of Zarqawi, right? There were thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of MQ-1 Predator operations to track this individual down, combined with other sources of intelligence, and they were able to try to figure out when he'd be in a specific location rather than just having to carpet bomb an entire area to try to get one target. So I don't know if that addresses your question at all.
It sounds like you're saying the military is convinced that drones are wonderful.
No, I think everyone recognizes some limitations to any weapon system, but I think they do offer a very effective tool to carry out certain types of operations. And again, military weapons are designed to carry out some type of policy objective, and you just have to try to find the best tool for the specific scenario.
So going back to that Title 10 and Title 50, I guess, versions and the stuff that is under DoD control, and perhaps in terms of privacy. So this is a technology we now have which has expanded our control and reach and the things we could do in different circumstances. Looking at the NSA situation that we just had, we didn't have the computer technology this level of it 20 years ago. Now that we have it, it's very much out of public's control and understanding of how much it is being used and how it is being used. We just read something in the news and we just pass by it, and we assume just somebody in the government is taking care of that. And now we have the drone technology. So how much of it do you think we will be able to keep under control and verify how it is being used, and how much of it will be transparent based on the direction we are going and the technology it is providing to us?
Well, I would just say, I think just taking a step back, I think any technology can be used for good and it can be used for bad. And so this isn't the first time that we've had a new technology where all of a sudden we're worried about what some of the ramifications are of their use and or overuse. When Kodak cameras were first invented, people were really worried about the fact that anyone could have a camera and take a picture of them, and they called anyone taking a photo was called a Kodaker, and it was a derogatory term, Kodaker. Same thing with cell phones. When cell phones were first invented, if you look through the newspaper clippings from around that time, people were really worried about the fact that you could carry something around with you that could potentially even take a photo of someone else. Computers, same thing. People were scared of computers. They didn't want to be in the same room as a computer. They were worried about what it would do to it. So what it would do to us.
But, so we are not worried about it, not in terms of a biased fear or anything irrational, but logically. How much do you think we will have control over this? How much of it do you think would be transparent and self-interrupting? Yeah.
I think that there are risks with any tech. The point is that there are risks with any technology. It's not a matter of whether I think that fears are actually very rational. I don't think that people who are scared of getting their picture taken were irrational. I just think we're now experiencing, there are different capabilities with drones. If a terrorist arms a drone and blows up a building with a drone, they could have done that some other way, but the reality is, the possibility is out there. Everything can be used for good and for bad, and so we can't control all of that, but it does not mean that we shouldn't be taking advantage of the benefits of drones. We just need to do it in a way that wins the public's trust and protects its interests in every possible way that we can. And part of the issue is we don't know what all the capabilities of drones are. We don't know all of the different harms that they can inflict on us. We don't know all of the different benefits that they can provide. And so we're still in that learning stage where these are just now getting integrated in society in a way that benefits the public in certain ways and also provides certain risks. So a lot of that fact-finding will have to be happening over the next several years.
I think from kind of the state use of drones for warfare standpoint, there's a body of literature that's growing that says, the United States is the primary user of military RPAs today, really needs to set the precedent on how RPA should be used in military environments. And this gets back to your question earlier, ma'am. How do we shape international law to set these precedents on how to use RPAs appropriately? And so one of the things that the State Department did a few months ago is they relaxed export regulations on armed drones. And a lot of analysts have said, well, this is a very good move because it allows the United States to start exporting RPAs to some of our allies and friends and partners. And if we export, that limits kind of the audience that potentially buy China's drones or Russia's drones, right? So it allows us to have a little bit more influence because in addition to just selling an aircraft, you're going to send trainers, and then pilots from those countries will get the opportunity to come to schools in the United States. And so you're able to kind of shape a mindset, and hopefully it's a mindset that is in accordance with international law.
Yes, sir.
What's the range of the sort of drones that we use in targeted killings? And what's holding back the development of a drone with the carrying capacity of a fighter jet?
So the ranges vary. If you go to airforce.mil and look up fact sheets, you can get kind of a good number that will give you kind of an idea. So just af.mil and type in fact sheets, and you can look up kind of capabilities of all of the weapon systems in the U.S. Air Force. And in terms of what's holding us back, there's been a lot of development, right? So there's the UCAV project that's developing much more advanced RPAs, but right now I think it's just a matter of need. For the past decade and a half, we've been fighting a war that's required counterinsurgency aircraft. We want something that can loiter around for a long time and find individuals. And so that's where a lot of the money has been dedicated, right? So OCO funding, GWAT funding has been put into those programs. So as we shift and pivot towards potential other threats, you'll see money being moved elsewhere, and development happens where there's money. So.
I have a follow-up question. So I think, when was that? About a year ago, maybe, that they were talking about bringing some of the CIA program under DoD control. And do you guys know where is that going?
That's still
So where it was before?
Yeah, the recent drone strikes kind of re-triggered conversations about that. But it's still being reviewed.
Oh, okay, cool.
Can I ask a question about, I guess, kind of spans both of these areas. You talked a little bit about the intent-based, and that kind of determines where you are regulated. Are there different regulations for different usages? So maybe like agricultural drones are treated differently than surveillance drones. And what's to stop a military contractor who develops a drone for a military purpose from then using it in a private capacity for some sort of commercial way?
Well, there's a few different categories. So there's hobbyist use, there's commercial use, and then there's public use. So if law enforcement is using a drone, they are broadly authorized to use them in cooperation with the FAA. They can use them so FBI will use a drone, for example, in the context of a specific investigation where there's a particular need for some kind of surveillance or aerial data collection. They don't do general surveillance. So they're not just going to take a drone and park it up on top of the city and watch people. Now, states and localities have broader police powers, but that's not the idea is that law enforcement and public agencies will use them in very particular circumstances. So yes, there's different, so public agencies are allowed to use things in a different way. If you're a commercial, and in one area where there's been a lot of confusion is universities. So if you're a public university operating in support of a public a core governmental function and you're operating a public vehicle in support of a core governmental function, then you can apply for what is a public certificate of authorization and get permission as a public entity. The key there is that core governmental function has been very narrowly defined in the university context to mean aeronautical research. So a university can be a public entity if it's for the purpose of drone use, if it's studying drones and how they fly and how a drone can be designed that is great for precision agriculture. That could be an aeronautical research purpose, but studying precision agriculture with drones is actually not a core governmental function. Educating students is not a core governmental function. Research and development that does not relate specifically to study of drones or study of aeronautics is not a core governmental function. And so universities are actually treated like commercial entities for that purpose. So a university would need to get a 333 exemption just like Amazon or any other company, which is interesting because you wouldn't think that. So a lot of the legislation, there's been a lot of kind of public policy efforts on behalf of certain groups of folks. Everyone wants a carve out for their own industry, wants to be able to do whatever they want. But the reality is the first rule that will come out is going to broadly authorize, give us the ability to fly drones, but there will be certain, restrictions. You can't fly at night. You can't, you have to remain within visual line of sight. So the operator has to have the capability of seeing the drone at all times. That will limit, for example, and you can't fly in like urban locations. So, I mean, a lot of pipeline inspection or railroad inspection, it obviously doesn't, or precision agriculture, it's not an economical use of a drone if you have to move every mile with the drone, right? I mean, the idea is that you should be able to send it 400 miles and send it back, and it will have studied and examined the pipeline or the railroad on the way and on the way back. So some uses are not going to be beneficial just yet, but down the line, the FAA just announced this Pathfinder program where it's working with specific areas in industry. So CNN, they're working with the FAA particularly on how to allow drones that will operate commercially for news gathering purposes in urban locations. So whether that means tethering the vehicle, for example, perhaps connecting it to the ground in some way would make it not a drone, essentially. It would mitigate a lot of the safety risks in urban locations. And that might be something that we see in the future. Precision agriculture, the company Precision Hawk is partnering with the FAA to study how drones can be used for precision agriculture beyond line of sight. And BNSF is partnering with the FAA to study how drones can be used beyond line of sight for railroad purposes. So there's a lot of study and research and development that's going on out there, and there will be approved operations on all of those three things. And we'll just see that expand over time. And so I think we will see beyond line of sight operations. We will see nighttime operations, but it's just not going to be right away.
I'd like to invoke the moderator's privilege to actually get into an area of commercial drone operation that we haven't actually touched upon yet, but which I think is going to be pretty important going forward, especially with the FAA rules and Cory Booker's recent piece of legislation. The FAA seems to draw a relatively arbitrary distinction between hobbyists and commercial use of drones for whatever reason. My question for you, Lisa, is...
And that's actually a legislative thing.
Right. But my question would be, what about journalist use of drones? Because technically they're not hobbyists, but they're also not technically doing it for commercial purposes. So how do we kind of deal with that?
I mean, they're considered, they're considered commercial for the purpose. I represent CNN. Yeah, I represent a lot of broadcasters. I represent CNN. I represent folks who fly the news gatherers who fly drones. And right now, according to the way that the law is written, they are considered commercial entities. Okay. There are different First Amendment concerns in that context. I think obviously they're gathering information for the public, and so the idea is we want to get them as much access as possible. But we're looking at a bunch of different options for that community, including the CNN FAA agreement, which would include, in order to get permission to be able to fly in urban locations. That's what news gatherers really want, to be able to fly over people. And that is, and so that's why the tethered option is looking good for the news gatherers in particular, but perhaps for others. If you can probably see I filed CNN's 333 petition, and it asked for approval to fly a tethered vehicle, in addition to some other vehicles. But you know, I think it would be great if news gatherers were allowed, kind of like universities and news gatherers were allowed to fly as if they were hobbyists. There was guidance that came out of the FAA recently in the last probably 2 months that stated that if a journalist gets sent, so there's a lot of video and photos that are taken by hobbyists, and if a hobbyist sends a journalist their video or photo, the journalist can actually use that in certain cases. So normally, you know, even though it's kind of a commercial thing, they're not purchasing. CNN isn't purchasing the image from the hobbyist. They're giving it over, and it wasn't for the hobbyist. Was still a hobbyist essentially. And so that's also kind of one workaround, is that you can still use hobbyist videos or data that was collected, as long as it wasn't done in a way that is commercial in spirit. But yeah, I mean, it's been a big conversation. There's a bunch of media organizations. You know, CNN is working with Georgia Tech. There's a group of media organizations, the National Association of Broadcasters. It's very this year at the National Association of Broadcasters big conference, there was a huge aerial and drone pavilion that took up a huge space, and it was really exciting. I mean, news gatherers and film producers are so excited about the use of drones, particularly because helicopters are so dangerous. So I don't know, for example, the Twilight Zone movie accident several years ago killed actors on the set because the helicopter was filming the movie, or camera on the helicopter was filming the movie, and it crashed and killed people on the set. A 55-pound drone that crashes is not going to kill anyone. It might kind of, I mean, I guess it could theoretically, but it will more likely, it just wouldn't have as bad of consequences. So it's just a lot safer where there are people around to operate a drone than operate a helicopter. And so news gathering and film production are the perfect examples of that.
Actually, just going off the point you just referenced on, let's say, the danger of a drone falling out of the sky.
Yep.
How, under the current rules that apply, is liability being treated? Because, of course, if you fly a drone perfectly well, I mean, I think most quad rotors, one of the rotors gives out, plummets to the ground, hits someone.
Yep.
Well,
it depends what's proven. I mean, if that's like a defect in the product, it seems like that would be the manufacturer's liability. But and this is where there's a lot of back and forth on this right now, because so for example, the geofencing technology that if it works correctly would provide me, or would prevent me from flying over the White House. So for example, if I had geofencing technology on my drone and I'm the operator of my drone and I'm still able to fly it over the White House, is that because their geofencing technology failed, or is it because I'm an evil person who tried to fly over the White House? Right. So there's going to be we haven't seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of litigation that's happened. We haven't had incidents like that where there's been fights in court about who's liable, but there will be.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
It's a great question.
Again, there's a theory out there that our foreign policy is determined by the arms manufacturers. According to this theory, our ever-expanding use of drones would be the result of lobbying efforts by the drone manufacturers. What is the status of the industry with regard to military drones? Is it dominated by the usual big boys, Martin Marietta, and McDonnell Douglas, or is it a bunch of little people from other countries as well?
So for the major, drones that are in operations here, your Predator Reaper types and your Global Hawk. The Predator Reaper is General Atomics, and then the Global Hawk, I want to say, is a Northrop Grumman system, I think. So yeah, it's the big players, but then again, you have smaller companies that are building these things that people can toss out of their backpack to allow that Marine or soldier special operator to see over the next hill. And some of them are larger defense contractors, and some of them are smaller companies. But for your major weapon system types, those are kind of the large firms. But again, they're amalgamations of lots of different technologies. So the sensor on board might be made by one company, and then the airframe itself is built by someone else. So it's a mix.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to lop out my last question for our panelists. Okay, well, here it is. given that this entire panel has been about the future of drones, I'd like to hear each of you portend what the future holds from a military perspective and a commercial perspective for drones. Is it a net win? Is it a net loss? If so, why? If not, why? Eric, you can
I'll go first. So from a military perspective, I think you're going to see an increasing number of states operating remotely piloted aircraft systems. Currently, I think the number right now is something like 72 states operate some type of RPA. But again, technology takes time to develop. Not all countries have the economic resources of the United States and our closest partners. So I think you're going to see some states having these hobbyist type drones that they operate as part of their military fleets. But I think at the end state, I personally think that the proliferation of RPAs, if it's done well, and we have states like the United States actually setting precedents for responsible use of RPAs, I think it's a net win overall. I personally think they put a cap on escalation. So yes, the use of drones and the presence of drones might make a state more likely to initiate a conflict. But if a drone gets shot down, and we've seen this before, right? If the Chief of Staff of the Air Force came out publicly I think about a year ago now, and said, the Iranians took pot shots at one of our Predators operating over the Arabian Gulf, and our response was fairly minimal. If that had been a manned aircraft, the response would have been very, very different. So I think it creates this very interesting zone of escalation where you end up potentially increasing the likelihood of certain degrees of conflict, but at the same time, it puts a cap, compared to the use of manned assets.
And I think on the commercial side, we're going to see over time, over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to see drones increasingly take the place of helicopters. Drones increasingly take the place in some circumstances of people. I think like looking at Japan right now, 85% of crop dusting is actually done with drones. We're going to see that here in the United States. We're going to see a lot of the tasks that are, dangerous for humans to do, such as flare sec inspection, pipeline inspection. We're going to see drones being able to do all that. And then we're going to see every industry really move towards the use of drones commercially. We're also going to see, I do think there will be, something's going to happen at some point. There's going to be safety incidents. There's going to be privacy incidents. There's going to be a lot of things that policymakers will have to deal with along the way. But I think that will all inform the policymaking. Part of the problem, like I said, has been the lack of data. And once we have an open airspace, this is just the beginning. And 20 years down the line, this is just going to be a way of life. And we'll be talking about flying cars, and drones were yesterday's news. So.
Right, fantastic. So a more peaceful world with less likelihood of escalation to armed conflict.
We'll see.
And flying cars on the horizon. Right? Yeah. Fantastic. All right, well, everyone, special thank you to Lisa Ellman and Erik Lin-Greenberg.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Happy to.